Well, here we are in another location. Really trying to switch it up these days. Here we go. Yes, the front row, officer, the mayor added, in answer to one of the policemen. Lady Rachel is keeping a seat for him. He laid his bare hands on Blimp's neatly gloved one. Wait a little, he murmured. I want him to get well ahead. Right you are, your worship, said the sergeant. You two had a near shave, said Mr. Geard. Tut-tut, twere nothing to the dust I've seen kicked up in my time, replied the sergeant. His lordship ain't as young as man as he was 10 years ago. A mob's a nasty thing, said Mr. Geard, giving the man such an understanding glance that Blimp answered with a wink. His nerves ain't what they were, he said. The mayor's looked round. It was extraordinary how quickly the crowd had scattered. I don't want any arrests made, nor does Lord P., he remarked emphatically to a policeman who was holding their horse's head. The animal was still trembling a little. The man touched his helmet. As your worship wishes. Drive away after your master, sergeant, said Mr. Geard directed, but not fast. I want to see him safely in his seat. I really butchered that line. The policeman let go of the bridle, and the green-wheeled dog-cart set off at a walking pace towards the scene of the pageant. They soon reached a spot from which it was possible to get a clear view of both audience and performers. Pull her up a second, Sergeant, the man obeyed, and they waited till they could observe the figure of Lord P., with the two policemen close behind him, threading their way through the crowd of strikers. When they had disappeared, drive over to that tent if you don't mind, commanded the mayor. Just coffee today. Arrived at the entrance to his huge refreshment pavilion, Mr. Geard told Steve Lew, who had now resumed his fascinated attendance, to run in and ask Mr. Cantle to come out. It was now the destiny of Sergeant Blimp to set eyes on the feeblest, weakest, most worried and most bewildered caterer he had ever seen or ever desired to see. I'm going to send you some guests of my own straight away, Dickory, said the mayor. Treat 'em well. Don't let 'em get drunk. And turn 'em out without fail before 5 o'clock. All out before 5 o'clock. Dickory Cantle, whose eyes were a pale, light, moist blue, and whose beard was straggly and thin and like bleached tow, was so surprised at the sight of the green cart and black horse that he could only open his mouth and blink. Is Elfin inside? Inquired Mr. Geard. Steve Lew heard this, if Elfin's parents didn't, and the young Cantle, with his thin legs and black Sunday stockings, soon made his appearance. Tell your mother and her people that I'm going to send her some guests for refreshment in a minute. Tell her beer and wine and sandwiches, and tell her all out before 5. Will you, Elfin? All out by 5. I don't want 'em to clash with the other people. Elfin Cantle's blue eyes, not pale blue like his father's, who was now muttering something quite incoherent about brands and vintages, but deep blue like the broad sky above them, gleamed with intelligent understanding. Am I to tell Mother any sum that your worship once would wish her to, he began. Tell her all that's reasonable, pronounced Mr. Geard emphatically. Elfin's blue eyes deepened in color till they grew nearly black. Then, brushing some dust from his thin legs, thin as matches, those poor emaciated legs that were the fons et origio of the big tent, he lifted up his face. Mother will understand. Mother thanks you for his heart, your worship. Come, father, he added. Dickory Cantle followed Elfin into the tent, as did also Steve Lew, bestowing on the mayor before he departed a final glance of fanatical devotion. The green-wheeled dog-cart drove off now. It encircled a seated audience from whose throats excited and vociferous applause was now rising as the king and queen, with their great golden crowns upon their heads, rose from their thrones and moved to the side of the Lady of Shalott. The movement of the dye works factory hands, with their Protestant allies and their secular banners, had not been missed by Mr. Geard. All the way down the hillside, as he was racing to the rescue of the Marquis, he was thinking desperately how to cope with this menacing invasion. He could catch, as Blimp trotted his horse along the edge of the vast concourse of people, the constant murmurs of "Order! Order! Hush! Hush!" addressed to these men, who continued to talk loudly among themselves, even though the poles of their banners were now planted on the earth. When they came level with the row of seats at the end of which sat Mother Legge, Mr. Geard called upon Blimp to pull up. Here they waited, watching for the close of the scene of the grassy stage above. It was near the end. After a second or two of waiting, it ended, and the play actors, well contented with this ovation they had just received, marched off to their respective pavilions. Oh, boy. A general buzz of excited talk ran through the whole mass of people. The dog cart had drawn up close to where Mrs. Legge and Blackie Morgan were sitting. Between their horses' heads and the ends of the first 5 rows of seats was the back of a banner, the poles of which rested on the grass, carrying the words, "Down with Mummery." These words Mr. Geard now contemplated as he acknowledged the salutations of the people near enough to recognize him. Mother Legge herself made an airy gesture with her black-gloved hands that was almost as if she kissed the tips of her fingers to the mayor of Glastonbury, and many of the seated crowd looked towards him and nodded towards him as they continued their boisterous clapping, as if directing their applause to the organizer of the performance as much as to the players. The crowd of dyework strikers was obviously ill at ease at this juncture. The big audience behind them had time now to concentrate their attention to these men whose banners, "Down with Religion, Down with Capital, Down with Mummery," flapped beside them in the warm summer wind. Several of Philip's policemen were now standing about, surveying these revolutionary scrolls with humorous detachment, but Mr. Geard observed one of these officers edge himself in front of the knees of the people in the second row till he came behind Lord P, into whose ear he whispered something that made the Marquis turn round and glance at the strikers. The applause had now prolonged by the foreigners long after it had ceased among the native-born, but it died down now, and the general murmur of conversation all about over the big audience took its place, in the midst of which some very curious and surprising preparations were going on the stage in front of them all. A big wooden cross was brought out, from which were hanging thick ropes, like those used on shipboard, twisted loosely round its crossbeams, and this object was laid on the ground, where the thrones of Arthur and Guinevere had formerly been, besides a capacious hole that had been dug to receive it. Across the faces of the audience was blown in intervals the warm sun-sweet smell of trodden grass, and mingled with this the pungent smell of nicotine from the short clay pipes which many of these strikers, quiet, patient family men, had lit to cheer their suspense. It was at this moment that the voice of Red Robinson was heard with shrill, penetrating tones. Red had got hold of a chair and had jumped up upon it. From this elevation he began to scream forth a hurried torrent of abuse, raising his hands high into the air and making them tremble there, using in fact that particular gesture which had become almost a convention with street orators, by which still retains a power that its own peculiar quality. Mr. Geard saw 2 of the 3 policemen pushing their way towards the shouting man. "Give him 5 minutes, officers, if you please." This command from the green dog cart was flung out in those senatorian tones which used to be the delight of the slums of Bloody Johnny's revitalistic meetings. The officer stopped stopped, turned, and remained motionless, glancing alternately at Lord P, seated by his daughter's side, and at the bare-headed mayor in Lord P's cart. "You Wessex people who have come here to hear this folly, listen to me. And you foreign people who have come from hover and seas to see this folly, listen to me. And you Glastonbury comrades who know what this folly is, listen to me. I have only one thing to say this afternoon. The capitalistic system of society is doomed. In 100 years from now, private property in Glastonbury will be unknown. This here new mayor of ours is no better than the light one, and has for Crow up there with his blasted airplane." He jumped down hurriedly from his chair, took refuge within the close-packed ranks of his friends. For this, the enraged figure of Lord P, standing erect now and calling furiously upon the policemen to stop him, had counteracted the command from the green cart, and the officers had moved towards him. It was then that Dave Spear jumped up from his seat and lifted up his voice. "This man," shouted Spear, "may have been too angry to choose his words as he ought, but what he says is true. Humanity will soon—" And at the scholarly intonation of the young philosopher, all the Germans in the audience, who were the ones who knew English best, leaned forward, listening gravely and intently. Indeed, they cried out in guttural protest against such nasal French voices lifted up in derision of Spear's words, and for a moment it looked as if the old hostility between Gothic blood and Mediterranean blood would burst out that day in herbs vitra under Gwynap Nudd's mischievous rogueries. The particular tone of Spear's plunged into at once, so earnest and so academic, and his introduction of the word humanity beguiled the Russians who were present, all except the monks from the Caucasus, who took him for a devilish heretic, and brought them over to his side. The Spanish contingent, which was unusually large, agreed on the contrary very strongly with the French, and joined the French in calling angrily upon the young man to sit down. But Dave Spear, in spite of cries of "Order! Silence! Turn him out!" refused to sit down. "Humanity will soon," he shouted, "be no longer Germans, Englishmen, Frenchmen, Russians. We shall all be men and women, working for ourselves, not for the rich, in one great community of comrades." The clamor around him got now so confused that it became impossible to outshout it, and after calmly surveying the whole crowd with his eyes and watching them as if he were a shepherd counting his sheep, Dave Spear sat down. The group of strikers from the Crow Works were now thrown into a most awkward and uncomfortable position. The bulk of them had no sympathy for the communistic opinions of their leaders. They were unable to enjoy thick open-air theatre, as they regarded it, because of their near neighborhood to the gentry. At the same time, being honest Somerset workingmen, they were reluctant to desert their flags. One of the most dignified among them, a certain Josh Whitcomb from Queen's Camel, articulated the thoughts of the majority among them, when he said to himself, "What in the name of crikey be I doing here? A dang fool I be, when I might be digging tatties in me bit o' garden this fine more holiday. This here crow be a bloody blighter. There ain't no two opinions about that, but what be all this highfalutin palaver got to do with it? Why, crikey, I wish I was sitting peaceful like in me back garden, watching me sweet peas how girt they be grown. This here Glaston will never be a place for quiet folk to enjoy themselves in, till both this blighted crow and this blighted Geard be drove out of town." Mr. Geard was not oblivious to the growing discomfort of this body of worthy men. Left to themselves now by both agitators and police, they were being subjected to the animosity of an increasing number of the audience, who had come to regard their presence at the field at all as a lugubrious spoil sport. Mr. Geard now made Blimp drive by my lord's cart forward, about twice its own length, till it was in the very centre of the sulky and disconcerted crowd. Then he stood up in the cart with his hands on the sergeant's shoulder. "Gentlemen," he began. All eyes were turned towards him. He managed to temper his voice so that it was only audible to the men he was addressing. It was an immense relief to him to observe that Elfin Cantle had joined his young adherent Steve Lou, and that both the boys were standing now close up to one of the green wheels of his cart. "Gentlemen," he repeated, "I'm sorry that you should have come out today only to find things unsatisfactory. I am the mayor of this town, and I wish all Glastonbury people to enjoy themselves today. I have told Mr. Cantle down there in that tent," he waved out his plump hands in the direction of the hedge, "that I wish him to give all you men of the Crow Dye Works something to eat and drink at my expense. Elfin Cantle, I see, is here. He'll show you where to go. Take them with you, Elfin." Then, as an afterthought, he added, "'Twill be a shame on ye all, and a disgrace to your mayor, if the good liquor that is in yon tent be taken back to cellar." There was a moment's hesitation, and then Mr. Bird of Stoke Subham spoke up. "Three cheers for the Mayor of Glastonbury!" he cried. At once another voice in the crowd was raised, but it was impossible for Mr. Gear to identify him. "Three cheers for Bloody Johnny!" The cheers were somewhat nervously and somewhat shamefacedly given, and the big audience of seated people extended now as far down almost as the hedge craned their necks to see what a new thing would be now was toward. Suddenly Matt Decker rose from where he sat by his son's side. "Three cheers for the Mayor of Glastonbury, who has given us this..." His voice was drowned in a terrific volley of applause. Well, I'm going to end it there for today. Till next time, cheers from Glastonbury.